We have the first speaker, which is Sky Shields, who is the leader of Lin's famous basement group from Windy Hills. So he will speak for himself.
Okay, so I would like to take up the theme. It's a theme that is taken up in this recent video, the recent series of videos that we've had, which have gone under the title, Is the Past Fixed?, but which are tackling a question that might be best described as the ontology of mind. That is, that the theme is, people have a lot of different concepts, I think, attached to the word mind, but the problematic thread that I think runs through all the different concepts people have of mind is that somehow mind is something which we possess. There's something that we recognize exists in us, but is completely distinct and is maybe observing something out there in the objective universe. That is to say, you've got something in you want to call mind, you want to name yourself that has certain laws, certain rules to it. Certain words seem to come to mind when you think about it. Ideas, concepts like morality, beauty. There are certain principles that you consider to be definite principles of mind. But then these are not necessarily principles that you would assume exist in the so-called objective universe. You assume that there must be some other thing out there that, perhaps is more logical, perhaps has other characteristics to it, and we are using our minds to observe it. The theme of this video series, and what I'd like to cover today, using some of the work of Vladimir Vernadsky, I'd like to disabuse you of that idea and develop a notion instead that this thing we call mind has a fundamental ontological significance. That is to say that everything that you know as a physical universe is derived from that exact same process that you know in yourself as mind, to the extent that you recognize it in yourself as in others. That this is a principle that has a very serious ontological significance, that it is the basis for everything that we see in creation. And in the course, we'll see that the scientific facts of the matter agree very closely with the notion that you find in the Abrahamic religions of man being made in the image of the Creator. We'll demonstrate that this is actually a very rigorous scientific concept, and it's the basis for all human knowledge, and it's the basis of all human economic activity in the universe. The ability for the human species to act on the universe is based on this principle, this ontology of mind. But to do it, I'd like to give people an introduction to a thinker who you've probably seen in various works of the movement. Mr. LaRouche references works in a number of different papers, a number of different locations. This is the Russian biogeochemist Vladimir Ivanovich Vernadsky. He's most well known as being the founder of the notion of, he's not the person who coins the word, but he's the person who most rigorously develops the concept of the biosphere. And that is, in its short description, it is the envelope of the planet on which we recognize the existence of living processes. But in its more in-depth investigation, it actually becomes something much larger. To make the point that people have seen, I think, in some of the recent discussion we've had on that's come under the rubric of cosmic radiation, the actual entire first half of his book, The Biosphere, is describing processes that you would call, that would also fall under that rubric of cosmic radiation. That is to say, his definition of that thin layer of the planet that we call the biosphere is that this is the only part of the planet which interacts with the rest of the cosmos. This is the part of the planet that most actively interacts with the rest of the cosmos, largely through the process we know as photosynthesis, where you've got the steady flow of radiation from the sun, electromagnetic radiation from the sun, being used to catalyze an amazing negentropic process of the development of the beginning of all the food and all of the energy cycles you see on the planet, the construction of the carbohydrate structures that form the bodies of these plants, and that are eventually later on incorporated into the bodies of animals to be recycled to pass through the biosphere and what Vernadsky called a biogenic migration of atoms, ultimately to become the structure of that biosphere itself, to, via the death and the decay of various living organisms, to become, and other generated waste products, to become the mountains, to become the soils, to become the oceans. You've got a steady flow that, if you were to view it as this biogenic migration of atoms, would be something that continued from the far reaches of our cosmos into that thin layer we know as the biosphere, and becomes the very structure of the Earth the rest of it as we know it. That's the scope of what he's actually describing. But in the course of describing that, he ends up drawing some conclusions which have major implications for ontology in general, but which we'll see, once we follow this path, leads us directly to this question of the ontology of mind. So I'll give you some background that Vernadsky's life is a funny one. We've discussed this in the past. It spans a time period which it's a very unusual but very interesting and rich time period. It roughly spans a period between the American Civil War and World War II. So positions him in an interesting place. He lives half of his life in Tsarist Russia and half of his life in post-Tsarist Russia. And he's a major political player in organizing for the overthrow of feudalism in Russia in particular, but because of his scientific views, he realized the necessity of this being the complete elimination of feudalism in order to facilitate the evolution of the human species. So just to give you some idea of where he stands, a lot of his work leading into the Russian Revolution and out of it was on the topic of human economic studies for that reason. Looking at you'll find studies of his on comparing different types of farming practices between the U.S. at the time. He does a study of U.S. agriculture, European agriculture, as he's trying to find out what's going to replace the structure of the feudal structure that existed in Russia at that time. He's looking to say, well, after revolution, what should be the economic, if you're going to end the idea of serfdom, you're going to end the idea of a feudal structure under the Tsar, what should replace that? And in his mind, this was a real question of the scientific evolution. This is a question of the evolution of the human species. And you'll find writings of his on that subject already in the late 1890s, early 1900s. That this is a theme that's on his mind. But he's investigating that at the same time as he's doing some early geological studies with his teacher Dokuchayev, examining looking at the nature of soils, looking at the natures of the mineral composition of the Earth's crust. In the course of this study, he quickly realizes that it's not possible that when he's looking at these minerals, he starts realizing that you're not observing a fixed system. That what you're looking at is a process that exists. He said that you're looking at a process that changes and evolves. And very early on, he makes a statement that you see a process that exists in time. And this strikes him as early as, again, the 1890s, early 1900s. This strikes him as being something that's unique to first geological processes, but then he realizes that every place you see change in these geological processes, it's connected to the action of living processes. And he realizes, his background is initially only in geology, but he realizes that he needs to hurry up and give himself a crash course in the biological sciences in order to be able to make any useful statements about geology. And so he does this. He does a whole investigation himself of figuring out, of just getting what we later recognize as his impressive map of all life on the planet, really everything you could possibly imagine, because he realizes that all of this entire biosphere is involved in acting on and developing and changing the underlying abiotic structure of the Earth's crust. But then it begins to spark in his mind from that observation of the way these biological processes operate on geological processes, makes him begin to realize that if this is true, then that earlier recognition he had about the fact that geology is a science that exists in time means that the thing that he's calling time is closely connected to the action of living processes. And in fact, he coins a term that becomes very controversial, which he calls the eternity of life. Now, this has got two interpretations at present. One is a very practical interpretation, which is not unuseful, but it's a very important thing to notice and kind of wrap your mind around, that to the extent that he can observe these changes in geological structures over geological time, every metric of change that you have to look at is something that's connected to life. Everything from carbon dating, all of your dating methods in your geological strata depend on living processes. So he said, but then he says that these changes in the geological strata were exactly the thing that separate geology from the other sciences, because it gives it this feeling, this sensation that you want to refer to as time. And then the way what he concludes from that is that there's never been a period on the planet when life did not exist. Now, this is very interesting because, for a couple of reasons. The first thing that should come to mind is that we had a discussion earlier is, well, I mean, isn't it true? Wasn't there some period of time where the conditions on the Earth were so hot, so impossible around the formation of the Earth that you couldn't possibly have life? How could you have this guy Vernadsky claiming that life as a principle is something that's eternal if wasn't there some point where you couldn't have living things? Doesn't there have to be some moment of what's called abiogenesis, where life has to spring out of nothing and come into being? And Vernadsky is very insistent that no, this is not true. And as early as 1908, we have him making the statement that, which he'll refine. I'll give it in the form he gives it in 1908, but we'll see as time progresses that his development of this notion becomes much more complex. But he says in 1908 that life, he's beginning to recognize, is a principle that is, he says now, as fundamental as matter or energy. I'll give you the exact quote here. Oh, we won't have that one. I actually don't have. But this is as early as 1908, so you can give an idea of where his mind is going. That's obviously very different than the standard reductionist view. The view that's prominent today is that somehow life is just some epiphenomenon composed out of non-living processes, and then cognition, we're just some epiphenomenon that grew out of living things. But he stresses no. He's saying that this principle of life is something that exists, that he says is eternal, that predates all other phenomena that might be observable. This by 1920, he comes under very heavy attack for that specifically that notion, this idea of the eternity of life. This is a period after he plays a major role in the overthrow of Tsarism in Russia. But there's a coup that's launched by, he recognizes it as some sort of meddling. He's not totally clear that this is the meddling of the British Empire to ensure that the revolution that occurs is the Bolshevik revolution and not the kind of revolution that Vernadsky is looking for. But this happens. In that context, you have the takeover in Russia of the ideology of dialectical materialism, which is the materialist aspect of that requires the sort of reductionist notion of the progression upwards from the abiotic into the biotic into the cognitive, whereas Vernadsky's making this insistence that processes are organized in the opposite direction. At this point, he's only being very explicit that it's life as primary that governs the processes that are below it, but then we'll see he develops that further. But this becomes a huge deal. The paper he writes on the subject in 1920, which is called The Origin and Eternity of Life, is actually completely censored. It's not allowed to be published. And the book in which he was planning to publish it is heavily redacted. The piece that's most heavily redacted is his piece, Human Autotrophy, which is a piece on the willful evolutionary development of the human species. So this sort of gives you an idea of the context. Later on, as maybe we'll have a chance to discuss as we go, this notion of the eternity of life is exactly what Alexander Oparin is deployed to attack in Vernadsky's work, to attack and try to attempt to rework and rewrite and to explain away. But we'll see that Vernadsky is not only insistent upon that principle, but his later work develops that to an even higher level. A major change in his development in this concept occurs in a period around 1924, when he's working in the, he moves to France to work in the laboratory of Marie Curie. Now he's working there on various topics, many of which are dealing with the notion of dealing with radioactivity, obviously, and radioactive dating methods, which he saw as a major way to see this expression of time and development in the biosphere. But while he's there, he has a series of personal discussions with Marie Curie, and she relates to him the work of her husband, Pierre Curie. And that series of vignettes, it's interesting to see. He describes her description of dinner table discussions with the family, which would be Pierre Curie, Marie Curie, and their daughters on scientific topics. And mentions that they had a very peculiar working style, as he recognizes it as a very peculiar working style, which is that they would spend a long time in discussion. He said they would spend months in just discussion amongst them, developing these ideas in their head, and then Pierre Curie would write a very short paper as a result. And Vernadsky does a little summary. He points out that the Curie's life's work, which he says it's about, I forget what he gives, a figure of, I actually don't have the numbers here, so they'll be missing. He gives a figure something like 25 some years, some number of decades of life's work fits in one volume. And he says not because he's not a prolific writer, it's because he writes these incredibly dense summaries of his thought process. But as a result, when Pierre Curie is killed, he doesn't get a chance to write out the final project that he was working on, which was a generalization of work that had been done earlier by Louis Pasteur. Now this was some work that Vernadsky was obviously very familiar with, which is on the question of handedness or chirality. Now this was Pasteur's observation that there was a distinction between the same chemical compounds when they were produced the exact same chemical compound, which is chemically identical, meaning that it undergoes the exact same reactions, is produced in the exact same way in each case, but there's something fundamentally different when that compound is produced, for certain compounds, when they're produced by living processes or in a laboratory outside of living processes. And that difference is expressed in the ability of these compounds to rotate a plane of incident light. If you have light that's polarized to oscillate in a specific plane, certain compounds produced by living processes would exhibit an ability to rotate that plane of light, whereas the exact same chemical compound produced outside processes could not. And again, I'd like to stress that these, in other respects, these compounds are completely identical. They're completely chemically identical, but somehow their relationship to light changes on the basis of their being generated or not generated by living processes. Now, Curie saw this as an expression of a much more broad principle of symmetry. And he had discussed this, Pierre Curie saw this, and he discussed this in work with his family, in Marie Curie. Vernadsky found this very exciting, and in particular, he said that he was excited about the universality of this principle of Curie's. And in particular, it had two expressions. One is a quote that became very fruitful in all areas of investigation later on, where Curie notes that a dissymmetry is an event. Now you say, what does he mean by that? A dissymmetry is an event. I can give you a mental image which would help. If you were to picture in your head right now a rotating sphere. Now imagine that we're talking about a perfectly geometric sphere with no external markings. So if it were perfectly geometric, no external markings on it, would you be able to register that that sphere was rotating? And in fact, could you even give a meaning to rotation if it were perfectly geometric, no external markings to it? You find as you look at the thing, it looks exactly the same. If you do something to that sphere and you change its spherical symmetry, say we put a dot on that all of a sudden. So imagine you've got the spinning sphere, somebody comes with a paintbrush and they dab a dot on the side of that sphere. Suddenly you have motion, you have something you recognize as rotation. That as soon as you add a dissymmetry, you have something that becomes recognizable as an event. And Curie generalizes that to say that in general, whenever you see something that you recognize as a phenomenon, as an actual event, it's because you're seeing a dissymmetry that's generated out of a symmetry. Now this is important because that principle alone allows you to eliminate the idea of empty space. Because you realize that what seems to, in this case, to be an object in empty space, in that case you would say the dot moving on the surface of the sphere is not. What it is a process that initially seemed to be, with respect to some parameter, perfectly symmetrical. Suddenly some portion becomes asymmetrical. You introduce a singularity in that process, and the asymmetry relative to the symmetry registers to you as an event, as a thing. And the simple sense perception response to that is to say, well, this is an object, whereas what you had before was empty. But in general, Curie says, no, that's not. Everything you see as an event or an object is, in fact, a dissymmetry being measured against a pre-existing symmetry. And that looks to you like object and ground. And so Vernadsky recognizes in this sort of that approach he's taking a very powerful heuristic tool. If we get a chance, we'll be able to see that. You'll find that in musical composition, that becomes a principle that you can play with, and you'll see how it moves the mind. What you recognize as background versus foreground, what you recognize even as silence versus sound in a musical composition, is really playing on this question of the symmetries and asymmetries in your mind. There is no such thing as empty. There's no such thing as empty space. But so Vernadsky's excited about this because he starts to realize that this gives you the ability now to eliminate all the notions of the physicists these sort of pre-existing, unquestionable notions of absolute space, absolute time, and matter. He says, well, these are fictions, these are mathematical fictions, and in the real world they don't exist, and you have to figure out a healthier way to get around them to be able to approach actual phenomena and describe actual phenomena as they are. So that becomes an exciting notion. But then he's also taken by the second element that's often called Curie's principle, which is that the symmetry of an effect must be contained in the symmetry of the cause. And so you ask, well, what exactly does that mean? Curie has famous examples of it. The most famous example is Pierre Curie and his brother, their discovery of the phenomenon of piezoelectricity. Now, it's not, it should be known, people may or may not be aware that their discovery of piezoelectricity, that is the ability for certain crystals, when compressed, to generate an electric current, their discovery is based entirely on considerations of symmetry, of recognizing what pre-existing symmetry exists in a crystalline structure, and upon its compression, what sort of changes in symmetry are you observing? What occurs as a result? And do the induced symmetries, do they or do they not agree with the symmetry of an electric field, of a generated electric current? And on that basis, he's able to determine, first predict that the phenomenon of piezoelectricity will occur, but then also be able to determine in what material could that phenomenon be generated. And it's premised on the idea that you can get the symmetries to agree between the electrical current and its associated magnetic field and the crystal itself. And Vernadsky hears this in his discussion with Marie Curie and then in his own reading of Pierre Curie's work, but then he connects that to an idea that was already dear to his heart, which is this question of there not being any observed abiogenesis. The idea, what he calls the principle of Redi, that life always comes from life. That is to say, you never see the spontaneous generation of a living process. In the history, what he observes in the history of the biosphere, you see the steady emergence of life from life from life, typically expressed as organism to organism, but we'll see that can become more, with the symmetry principle, it's going to allow him to expand this notion of life much more broadly than even that simple description allows. But what he does see also is that this peculiar symmetry that you see with the handedness, he goes back now and looks at the work that Pasteur had done on the ability for certain compounds, when produced by living processes, to be able to rotate the plane of light as it passes through them. And he starts to realize, well, there seems to be here an intrinsic handedness in the process itself. Pasteur himself had already concluded that this was a form of handedness that had to exist in the very, very small, that this was not some property of the compound in the large. I'll give you an example. It was already known that certain crystals could rotate a plane of light when light was shown on them. For instance, quartz crystal. Crystallized quartz, if you shine light through it, is capable of taking a plane of polarized light and then rotating that as the light passes through it. But if you liquefy the quartz, or you convert it into glass, the form that we often see it, in its liquid form or in solution, it loses that ability to rotate the plane of light. So you're able to conclude from that the rotation of light in the case of quartz has something to do with the crystal structure itself. But then, in the case of these living products, like the famous example we've discussed in a video on this subject on the website, is a case of tartaric acid. In the case of living processes, the plane of light is rotated in solution by the liquid itself, which means in Pasteur's mind that this is not something, so no matter how you change the structure of the liquid, it'll continue rotating the plane of light as the plane of light passes through it. So in Pasteur's mind, this is a product of the solution in the very, very small. This is something about a handedness to the geometry that goes into very, very small. He calls it molecular dissymmetry. Vernadsky takes a look at that and says that that thing that Pasteur is calling molecular dissymmetry is actually an expression of something much more fundamental. And remember, he's coming from the standpoint that he recognizes life as being an actual independent, active principle in the universe, a fundamental one. So what does he do? He takes that. He begins a discussion that he begins tossing these ideas around. They develop really to their peak in the period around 1929, 1930, 1931. In 29, he begins a correspondence with a mathematician, but a very interesting mathematician named Nikolai Luzin. It's interesting because Luzin is part of a very specific mathematical school in Russia at the time. It's a school that includes Luzin, another figure named Pavel Florensky. There's a number of these folks who, this I won't give as an endorsement necessarily, but to give you an interesting idea of where their mindset is, people who were opposed to dialectical materialism because they were opposed to the concept of continuity as being primary in philosophy. And they stressed that there'd become an over-obsession in mathematics in particular with continuity and continuous processes. And so the discussion amongst themselves in this group is that real processes are at their heart, at root, discontinuous. And in their discussions, you'll find that they discuss in particular political processes and social processes do not occur by some kind of gradual social evolution, that they occur of necessity by discontinuous leaps, they occur in revolutions. And so they stress that any kind of mathematical study that's not taking discontinuity into account is something that's problematic. Florensky, for his own part, goes so far as to say that he thinks that it has a net effect of separating man from God because of man's preoccupation with the necessity that things must continuously follow from what came prior. So we'll take that as that's simply to give you some context. And between them all, they form a group which was heavily opposed to the reigning ideology, the materialist ideology in dialectical materialism. Florensky himself is later executed. Luzin, in a major event in the early 30s, becomes a target for execution, which is eventually stopped by Vernadsky, groupings around Stalin and other people. But it becomes a very... I'll get into some of that and what's come, but this is just to give you a flavor of what the discussion is. So this is who Vernadsky writes to, asking him about this question of handedness. What he says is, he sends Luzin a copy of Marie Curie's book that she writes on. It's a biography of Pierre Curie written by Marie Curie. Vernadsky sends this to his friend Luzin, and he says, look, I'd like you to take a look at this, and I want you to tell me, based on this 29 is simply, look at this and tell me your thoughts on this. I'd like to know from your standpoint, is there any mathematical or geometrical significance to this question of handedness in living processes? That discussion may end up becoming taken up in person between Vernadsky and Luzin between 29 and 37, but the next letters we have between them are in 37. But before I get to that, I'd like to discuss some developments in between. But that letter in 29 just shows that this was something that was on Vernadsky's mind as a fundamental question and already connected to his idea of, at this point, the primacy of life as a process. But in 1931, something interesting happens. In 1931, Vernadsky, at this point already in his 70s, is, again, coming under heavy attack, political attack from different circles. Some groupings within the Soviet Union are defending him. Other ones are attacking him. Some of the ones that are defending him are attempting to defend his scientific work, but prevent it from being propagated into the general population, because people recognize that his concepts are obviously correct because they're effective, but that they would be dangerous were they taken up by the general population. So one of the major moves of the censors at this time was to, instead of stopping the publishing of his work, they would prevent it from circulating any wider than the Academy of Sciences. They would only allow the work to circulate within a very small circle of scientists and then limit the amount of publication. But in 1931, he applies to do research abroad and is denied, and is instead told that what he can do is he can go and study in a special vacation house that's been set aside for members of the Academy of Sciences. So he's understandably upset, but this year, 31, where he's in this vacation house, becomes a very fruitful year for him, because then a number of ideas that have been floating around in his mind begin to converge. One, his concept of the eternity of life, this idea of life being an actual fundamental principle. But then that combined with the notion of symmetry, as he had discussed it with Marie Curie from the works of Pierre Curie, and this combined though with certain other clear properties that he recognized. One is he recognizes the creative nature of living processes, that they express a very clear anti-entropy, where the only place that what you would call an arrow of time seems to be seen in the abiotic, at least in the small, is in what Sadi Carnot was able to describe for heat engines, which is their tendency over time for concentrations of heat to dissipate, etc., which was described as entropy and named entropy. And he makes the point, it was erroneously attempted to be applied to the whole universe by Clausius. He says Vernadsky makes the point, that was an invalid attempt to generalize it. Nothing experimental demonstrates that. And in fact, as Vernadsky will show, when you're talking about the whole universe, it's going to have a characteristic which looks much more like a living process than anything else. But he recognizes this anti-entropy, and he makes a very unique and interesting correlation, which is between that directedness of living processes, that anti-entropy of living processes, and the handedness as Pasteur had observed it. And he says, well, what we're seeing here in the case of the living processes is a handedness of time. And then in his writings, he says, well, of course, this makes sense because it was actually an arbitrary division that was done by Descartes and Newton to separate space and time into distinct things. In fact, you only have one phenomenon here, which is you would call space-time, but really physical space-time. It's a process. The thing you're calling space and time are reflections of some actual physical process there that's occurring. Since that's true, things that you see reflected in the characteristic space of a process should also be in the characteristic time. So whatever this handedness of space that we're seeing in Pasteur's work should also be connected to a handedness of time. And he starts a deep investigation of this, really getting into the thick of it around 31, where he does a full historical study of this discussion of everybody who tried to tackle time. And he concludes that is really at this moment that he's doing his work now is the first moment that we're going to be able to, that the greatest fallacy up until that point has been the idea really imposed by Newton that time and space are some sort of absolute that are not subject to be studied by the human mind, that these are something that you're supposed to take as a priori and not be able to question. He says, well, that's clearly wrong. He said, that's something that the mathematician may think, that's something that even the physicist may think, but it's not something that the real scientist, the naturalist, is permitted, has a liberty to think. So he begins elaborating this notion, and he says that he begins elaborating this notion. He begins a series of discussions. He writes a series of papers in 31 on this theme, on the theme of the, as he calls it, living time and sometimes biological time. But it's interesting that already in this period, he's beginning to, already in this period in the 1931, over the summer of 1931, he's beginning to realize that certain principles that you had already seen reflected earlier in his work about the nature of human activity and economic processes, he starts realizing that these are absolutely fundamental in discussing this question of even living time. And you see there in his work, as far as I can tell, the first reference to the works of Wolfgang Köhler and the Gestalt psychologists. And his explicit statement on that matter is, he states here that he references the work of Wolfgang Köhler and the Gestalt psychologists, and he says what's most interesting about them is that they recognize in perception the things that you would normally start to describe as a perception. Well, he says they point out the necessity of recognizing certain geometrical forms or structures for visual space, for tonal melody, and for other such phenomena, which are connected with the structure of the spatially and temporally identifiable cognitive apparatus. And he points out that the Berlin professor Wolfgang Köhler extends these notions about the psychical forms, about these cognitive processes, to phenomena of zoopsychology and to physics. And this becomes a new philosophical current of Gestalt philosophy. Now, it's important. I just want to draw your attention right there to that reference. He says specifically what he's talking about when he's describing this character of biological creative space-time is the best example of being able to start to examine these sorts of geometries is what you see specifically in psychology, specifically in the work of the Gestalt psychologists, but specifically in their work on vision and hearing, and specifically music. Note the reference there to tonal melody, because that'll come up. His discussion of the significance of music for these geometries and then for the notion of time will become interesting, especially when we come back to a discussion of what Köhler was working on at that time, which would have undoubtedly been known, elements of it would have undoubtedly been known to Vernadsky. But I'll come back to that. I want to do a little bit more on the arc of what Vernadsky was doing. But keep in mind that reference to, in his work on biological time, to specifically cognitive processes, specifically the work of the Gestalt psychologists, and then specifically the character of music, the role of music and tonal melody in this process. But that's 1931. You see that reference, and you find references. I know of one other reference at that time to Köhler's work, which is in his notes, being prepared around the same period. So that develops. And a number of other things begin to happen. He publishes those papers. He comes under heavy, heavy attack around in 1931 as a result of that. I should add, in January of that year, he'd already come under fire. In the magazine Bolshevik in that year in January, there was an article that was published which was called Subversives in Science. And it was one of these clearly things that, to get to how the process worked, you'd have these sort of moments of just riling up the population. You build this fever, you build a rage in the population into a fever pitch with the intent of targeting certain specific individuals, and usually they would meet with very bad ends. And at this point, Vernadsky had been attacked. He had never made a secret of his own attacks on dialectical materialism, and he'd been attacked publicly for this before, but this one had a particularly sharp edge to it. And he was put on a list with a number of other scientists, a very short list, with a number of other scientists, among whom was Alexander Gurvich, for the record, of scientists who this article in Bolshevik magazine claimed were using their scientific work and using their positions to draw political and philosophical conclusions. And I will make the point, he most certainly was using his scientific work to draw political and philosophical conclusions. And this was sort of I think this was a moment of clarity on the part of the enemy at this point. But he was singled out for attack. In that context, he still wrote what he was writing on this further development of his anti-reductionist work on life and extending it more explicitly into cognition in 31, and published it. Presented it actually at that fall's session there's a session they had at the Academy of Sciences, and he gave a speech on this, what he called the problem of time in contemporary science, where he included his work on life, he included the reference to the Gestalt psychologist, and he included the reference to music in particular. This came under fire from A.M. de Boron, who at the time was sort of the watchdog for dialectical materialism. He was the he was the philosophical defender of dialectical materialism. He was the person who would be assigned to try and attack you for being a subversive, and attack Vernadsky he did. He launched a massive, scathing attack. It was very vicious, but everybody also recognized, it was sort of universally recognized that it lacked content. Vernadsky, again, in his 70s, responded. Now, this was, again, I'm going into this just to give you, the sense of what the context was. This was a very sensitive situation. I mean, to draw other people who had come under this kind of attack had been exiled and or killed. That was clearly what some people, whoever de Boron was connected with, were lining up Vernadsky for. So it was important that he handle this well. And he writes a response, which I won't go into, but he writes a large public response and launches a very sharp counterattack on de Boron, and in it emphasizes his importance, Vernadsky's own importance for Soviet science and the maintenance of the Soviet Union, and really lacerates de Boron for attempting to stop scientific progress with this attack for his uneducated ideological reasons. And when you see de Boron's response after that, he actually puts de Boron on the defensive, which is very nice. And de Boron backs down begins nagging somewhat after that, but then backs down in that series of attacks. But now this frees Vernadsky up to do some other work, and he starts building networks to broaden this notion that he's been working on, this concept of a term. He borrows a term from that Pierre Curie used, that Marie Curie told him about, this states of space. So he continues his work on what he calls the states of space. But then he stresses everywhere he writes it, what he means when he says that is, he's referring to this physical space-time. So in what follows, I will often use the word space. In what follows, almost every time I use the word space, unless otherwise specified, I'm referring to a physical space-time, and he's clear on that himself. This is, again, most explicitly after this 31 period, where you've got his explicit work on time being carried out. So then in 1933, Vernadsky, then in his 70s, he meets in 30 he'd already met. He had met, in 1933 he meets with, in his diary he describes meeting with a 23-year-old researcher named Gauza, Georgy Francevich Gauza. And they discuss, and Vernadsky had been familiar with Gauza's mentor, was a friend of his, and Vernadsky had 3 years prior given his name as approved for publication Gauza's first published work. But in this meeting, Vernadsky is ill, and he's staying at a sanatorium to get better, a special sanatorium for members of the Academy of Sciences. And it's interesting, a number of people come to visit him. In 33, Gauza comes to visit him. And what he tells Vernadsky is that he's doing experimental work on this question of optical activity in the protoplasm. That he's taking up the questions that Pasteur had posed on the optical activity of protoplasm experimentally. And Vernadsky becomes very excited, and he is thrilled this is taking place, even goes so far as to offer Gauss a position in his laboratory, because Vernadsky sees in this the potential to extend experimentally his idea that, as he begins to word it around this time, that the principle that governs living processes is something that lies on a much more fundamental level than space, time, or matter. That this is something that space, time, and matter are a process that they're a reflection of. These are simply projections of something much more fundamental. So he offers Gauss a position. Gauss does not take it, but he agrees to research and publish things for the laboratory. The only reason Gauss doesn't take it is because he's if you take a look at the work, the areas he's working on at that time, they're so broad, he feels he'll be limited if he leaves university and goes to work for a specific laboratory. But to give you an idea of the number of things that come out of this, Gauss is able to confirm that the Pasteur principle of the handedness of time runs far deeper than this Pasteur principle runs far deeper than had even been suspected prior with just the optical activity. In fact, that if you are to take a look at the actual structural composition of an organism, there are certain principles of handedness that aren't violated. For instance, the handedness of proteins, the optical activity of proteins in living processes, the amino acids that compose proteins is always the same. You always have proteins that have what's called left rotary power. They'll always rotate the plane of light to the left. The sugars that are involved in the construction of living processes will always have right rotary power. They'll always rotate the plane of light to the right. And he does a lot of interesting work. He unfortunately comes under heavy fire from the Lysenko apparatus, and then the same groupings among the Soviet apparatus that are enforcing materialism as an ideology. Launch an attack on him. His main collaborator ends up being killed, is executed, and Gauss becomes sort of understandably afraid. His work takes a very practical turn. He continues working with Vernadsky, and Vernadsky never leaves the direction that he's on. Gauss makes a point, though, not to avoid the actual work, the conclusions that Vernadsky is drawing about the states of space, but discovers a number of very interesting things. One thing is he tries to, in the course of trying to take a practical job, he assigns himself to the work with the Soviet military in World War II, making himself indispensable and unexecutable, is the way he positions himself, that he's the only person who's able to develop antibiotics for Soviet Russia. And he develops the first, possibly the only during the war, I'm not certain, but definitely the first antibiotics, native antibiotics that Soviet Russia had during World War II were developed by Gauss. But an interesting spin on the story is he finds out that it's a naturally produced antibiotic that has a capability of rendering bacterial cell walls permeable and causing them to eventually just simply disintegrate. And he looks at their structure, and he breaks down the amino acid structure of the antibiotic, and he finds out that it contains exactly one amino acid with its which is mirrored in the opposite direction as that which should be required for living processes. Every other occurrence of that amino acid when it's in the organism is left-handed. In this one case in the antibiotic, it's right-handed. He experimentally switches the hand and turns it back left-handed, and it ceases to be an antibiotic. So he's able to demonstrate that the antibiotic characters of this thing is connected closely to the nature of handedness in the antibiotic. A whole class of these antibiotics are developed. They're called, remember the name? I think gramicidin S for gramicidin Soviet. But then there's a whole class of them, gramicidins. Each and every one of them contains at least one flipped amino acid, where if you flip the amino acid back, it loses its ability to be an antibiotic. So then you started realizing, despite the fact that he ceases to draw some of these more profound conclusions, he is able to conclude that this principle is a deep-running principle. Now we know that shows up in a number of different places. I'll just give like a list so people know that it's true that living processes are uniquely sensitive to the handedness of the chemical compound. I'll just give you an example. The same, people know maybe aspartame, which is the artificial sweetener. If you take the exact same chemical and reverse the handedness of it, it ceases to be sweet and becomes bitter. Chemically identical. Every experiment you could do outside of experiments with light would demonstrate those two molecules to be those two compounds to be identical, but the organism recognizes them as a universe apart in terms of their actual activity. The smell of caraway and spearmint is the exact same chemical. The difference is the handedness. So chemically identical, but your organism, recognizes them as being distinct. The limonene, which makes citrus fruits smell like citrus, orange, lemon, etc. If you reverse its handedness, it begins to smell like pine or turpentine. Some of these artificial drugs are nice. One called Darvone, in one form is a painkiller. If you flip it to its mirror image, it will have no effect on your pain, but it will cure your cough. And there's a number of all sorts of insect pheromones and things have completely different actions. Again, exact same chemical, just flipping the hand changes fundamentally its biological effect. So you realize that there's a symmetry principle there in living processes that's very specific and does not exist outside of it. In 1937, he continues his discussions with Luzin on this topic. And he asks Luzin, he says, well, look, I want to ask you something that's more profound. Is there anything in Euclidean geometry that can account for this distinction here? Supposedly, and this, the standard description of what the handed molecule is a handed molecule floating in a Euclidean space. And I've had discussions, we've gone to a number of these astrobiology events talking to the people who are supposed to be the main workers in this area. And you'll find they all subscribe to this idea. You cannot touch the nature of the space that things operate in. It is a Euclidean space with a handed molecule. But Vernadsky goes deeper. He says, well, look, is there anything in a Euclidean space that could distinguish fundamentally between these hands? And he assigns Luzin this investigation to figure it out. And they have a really wonderful dialogue back and forth. I won't go into all the details, but it involves them just really hacking and slashing at everything that's known about Euclidean geometry and beyond, and concluding that there's not a way to make this distinction in Euclidean space. And again, I'm summarizing a lot of a very interesting discussion. We can have some more on it. But then Luzin asks a friend of his, Finikov. He asked a number of mathematicians. They're all passing around Curie's book. And a friend of his relays back to Vernadsky that, well, no, in order to get to the phenomenon you're talking about, you're going to have to start looking at the works of Bernard Riemann. And so then you begin having a discussion here of Vernadsky with a number of other thinkers on the nature of Riemann's work. Beginning with they have a first pass series of discussions, and you see this develop over time. It culminates really in 1938, where Vernadsky holds a number of seminars at his house with these thinkers. At first, again, just more interesting. He initially asked Gauss to come and just talk with him, and then he gets a reply back that Gauss will not meet in private with any professor because there'd been some bad blowback from the Soviets due to people setting themselves up like that. He refused to set himself up in that way. But later on, Vernadsky was able to call together a larger meeting, including ends up with Gauss, another histologist. It essentially becomes two mathematicians. Sounds like we're setting up a joke. Two mathematicians, two physicists, and two biologists, and Vernadsky. Each of the two biologists are experts in the handedness in living organisms. Gauss and another thinker. Two physicists who are experts in one an expert in relativity, the other one an expert in spectrometry, and then the two mathematicians, Finikov, who was the expert in the Riemannian geometry, and Luzin, who was the expert in who had this streak of requiring the discontinuity, who said the continuity was the biggest problem you had in mathematics. And they have a number of discussions. Again, I'll just summarize the conclusion. These conclude with Vernadsky's conclusion in 38, what becomes the second in a series called The Problems of Biogeochemistry, that living processes express a distinct physical space-time, and that distinct physical space-time has to be of a Riemannian character. And again, there's a lot in this, but there's a lot more to that. But then in the course of discussing, working on it, he's got a number of references where he's very, very explicit. And again, I'll make these available in an upcoming paper. But he's very explicit that the mind is capable of understanding this. But in order to understand the actual character of the geometry that's characteristic of these living processes, it's necessary to embark on a more fundamental discussion of creativity per se. And you see a lot in his diary entries, him discussing the fact that likely the model that we're going to need to look at in order to look at the sort of phenomena, the space-time phenomena I want to look at here, is going to be the one that you find in the compositions of Bach, Mozart, and Beethoven. And I'll give the quotes available. Use quote after quote of him discussing that. This is in his private writings, not in the published ones, but you can see the direction that his mind is going. It's significant that he's doing this at the exact same time. This is almost exactly coincident with the time period where you see Einstein coming to some of the same conclusions. He makes an explicit statement in a dialogue he has with Planck that some of the phenomena that are being run into in physics, the quantum phenomena, can only be addressed from the standpoint, he says specifically of a Bach fugue. So you start realizing this theme is coming up. In that context, I'd like to go back and then remember that Vernadsky had started looking at Curler's work on sight and sound, and realized that Curler had been in a dialogue prior, and at that time and prior, with Max Planck, who Einstein was in his dialogue with, on exactly that theme, on the nature of the character of creativity as it expresses itself in music and in psychology for physics. I'm actually going to leave it at that point because that's frankly sort of the most honest thing that we could do here, because things actually are left at that point right now that, to give you an idea of where things stand, Vernadsky never finished founding the science that he wanted to found on that topic. There's an amazing body of work, and we want to assemble it so people can see what it is, but it was left unfinished. The threads that are required to be pursued there are very clear, though, on the investigation of creativity per se and its expression in the anti-entropic nature of living processes. That's going to have a very specific geometric characteristic that'll be reflected in the space-time of the process. All that's clear, but what's left to be done is going to require the work of people with sort of the expertise in the right areas, the right sort of the right sense of the physical scientific questions that are involved, but also the sense that the resolution lies in a higher domain of mind. It'd have to be a group of people that somehow had an expertise in classical artistic composition, maybe who performed it often, maybe like opened events with impressive performances. It'd have to be that same group of people that would do these musical performances, that would also engage in their free time in profound scientific discussion. It would have to be a group of people who was interested in the exact same sorts of economic questions that Vernadsky was interested in, because you'd have to be able to pursue a study of human activity in the large. So it would require a very specific kind of grouping that you don't often find in history. That exact same grouping would be well situated to finally pick up the thread where it was left by Einstein and Planck, where they didn't get much further than the recognition that everything, the whole approach quantum mechanics has taken to these questions is wrong. And the proper approach would have to be something that looked like the, again, the character of a Bach fugue. Now, again, that was left undone. It's going to require a very specific grouping of people to be able to pursue that. I think people might get the idea. I'd like to propose that this is a task that we take up and that we're sort of well situated to take up amongst ourselves. And that, frankly, there's nobody else on the planet except for our association that's in a position to answer these questions. Everything that came after has proven itself to be a dead end. The reductionist approach in biology has proven itself to be a dead end. The statistical approach in physics has proven itself to be a dead end. Not by coincidence, they're closely connected to the attempt to the statistical approach, the fraud that's launched in economics, because these are it's the exact same problem expressed across the board, the same underlying ideological problem. And the resolution to all of these, I think, will be found at once. But that's a discussion hopefully we're going to be having over the course of the weekend and then in perpetuity after this moment. So that's what I've got so far. We can pursue some more discussion afterwards.